A pile up in front of the blue paint. Still no whistle. Boldy got a stick on it. It comes free to the circle. Into the middle, Zuccarello. They score! Here in St. Paul. Zuccarello. Eriksson Ek scores! The hat trick!
Hey there, Twisters. So a couple days ago, the Minnesota Wild had this crazy comeback against the Vancouver Canucks. They were trailing 5-2 toward the end of the second period, and then they ended up triumphing 10-7. I didn't get a chance to watch this game in full, but when I saw the final score, I just about jumped out of my seat. And that got me thinking about comebacks, because these last couple of years, especially this year, have been bananas. We've had teams trailing by 3 goals or more and coming back to win those games, whether in regulation or in overtime. And this is just the most recent example of how this era of hockey might just be the most exciting of our lifetime. Now, some of us might have been watching in the 70s and 80s or even before that, so I'm a little bit younger, but in this case, this is definitely a far cry from the dead puck era and when we were coming out of the lockout as well in 05-06. And before I jump in here, I just want to welcome all the new Twisters. You might have come from the Link Gates video or the rivalry video on the Canadiens and Nordiques. Watch that if you haven't already. So we do have occasional videos like this covering the NHL today, in addition to our historical content. Stay tuned, we've got a great one on the Whalers coming out very shortly. So we'll dive into comebacks in the NHL in general, but first of all, just looking at this game, it was a 10-7 game, which started as 5-2, and then 33 seconds before the second intermission, the Wild start their comeback, and they would score 6 goals in a span of under 6 minutes. That is the fastest interval in the last 25 years. They would score 7 goals alone in the third period, and I know the Vancouver Canucks, they've done a pretty good job keeping the puck out of their net. I know they didn't have Thatcher Demko in net, but even so, to see a team like the Wild be able to topple one of the best teams in the NHL this year is very amazing and definitely speaks volumes about this specific era of hockey. Minnesota's 10 goals is also a franchise high. 3 of them came from Joel Eriksson Ek, 3 of them came from Kirill Kaprizov. They both had 6-point games. That ties a franchise high that was set by Marian Gaborik many years ago. He did that twice. And in addition to those 2 players, JT Miller for the Canucks also had a hat trick. So this is the first time in over 31 years that we've seen a game in which 3 different players have hat tricks. We have to go all the way back to the 1992-93 season when my San Jose Sharks had one of the worst seasons in NHL history, and they surrendered a couple of hat tricks to Wayne Gretzky's Los Angeles Kings, losing that game. It actually happened to be on my 5th birthday, but I wasn't following the NHL back then. And I bet there were other records that I didn't even touch on with that game, but let's zoom out a little bit here, Twisters. So let's talk about multi-goal comebacks. This is something that we've seen increasingly over the last few years. And the point that I want to make here is that just about anybody in today's NHL in the salary cap era, when we do see a fair bit of parity, but any team, no matter your record, has the ability to come back from these games when they're down 3 goals or more. So let me give you a few examples. So on December 23rd, the Avalanche had a 4-0 lead in the second period against the Arizona Coyotes, but the Coyotes stormed back to score 4 in regulation. They tie it up with just about 2 minutes left, and then they win in overtime. Or how about the game in Sweden between the Senators and the Red Wings? So the Senators had a 4-0 lead. The Red Wings erased that in the second period alone, but Ottawa actually wins that game with 2 seconds left in overtime on a goal from Tim Stützle. But from my perspective, of course, I'll be biased as a Sharks fan, but I think a lot of you can agree here. This really is amazing. The Sharks actually had back-to-back games this year where they overcame deficits of over 3 goals. So the first instance was against the New York Islanders. The Sharks were trailing by 3 goals in the third period. They stormed back with the net emptied. I think they scored twice there, and they won the game in overtime. And then the next game, they go to Detroit, and they're trailing 4-0 in the second period. They erase that deficit within that period, so I think there were a total of 8 goals. The Sharks eventually win that in overtime. And there were a couple of other instances when the Sharks were erasing third period deficits against much better teams. So with that in mind, we go back to the Wild and Canucks game, a 3-goal comeback, and certainly a barn burner, right? It was 10-7, but it doesn't need to be that high scoring of a game for us to witness that sort of drama. So while we still have barn burners in the NHL, and that can definitely extend into the playoffs, scoring is still nowhere near what it was in the early 90s and before that in the 80s, especially the mid 80s. Teams are averaging 3.12 goals per game. That's actually down a little bit from the previous year. But what I think we're seeing is a better harmony between having enough scoring and attracting more fans to the game that way. And at the same time, you still have games that are goaltender battles where the guy in net can actually be the difference maker. And also when I'm noticing these comebacks, it's really the way that they're happening, right? So in that Wild Canucks game, the Minnesota power play had a lot to do with that. Or you'll see more transition offense. You'll see somebody coming out of the box after serving a penalty, and there will be a huge momentum shift that way. I've seen teams come back for doing just that. Of course, teams emptying their net and being able to score multiple goals with the net emptied, that is a huge treat. And of course, in overtime, you have 3-on-3, and so the game can definitely shift in a matter of a few seconds. Now let's look at the data here around comebacks in the NHL. It's from the NHL's website. So this year, comeback wins, so when you're trailing by at least one goal, they account for 42.2% of all games. That is the highest since the NHL came out of the lockout in the 2005-06 season, which was at 43.7%. Strangely, there have been just 5 instances of a comeback of at least 3 goals this season, whereas we had 10 of those just 4 years ago, and in the 06-07 season we had 12 instances. But what stands out to me is that the percentage of games in which a team headed into the third period and was trailing but came back to win is the second highest rate it's been since this statistic was tracked decades ago, at 18.2%. So the highest came in that 06-07 season at 18.5%. We're about 2/3 of the way through the season, and so far there have been 16 comebacks of at least 3 goals. So if you prorate that to the end of this year in April, right, we end up with maybe 23 or 24 of said comebacks. And that would put us in comparison with what we saw in the barn burner days of the 1980s. So some of you might have been wondering, well, what's the greatest comeback in a single game in NHL history, and what is the highest scoring game in NHL history? So I'll weigh in on that here. We do have several instances of a comeback from at least 5 goals, some that have happened in more recent years, but plenty of which have happened in the 1980s. So in 1987, the Flames overcame a 5-0 lead in the third period against the Maple Leafs. They win that game in overtime, I believe. Then 2 years later, they overcome a 5-0 deficit against the Quebec Nordiques. They were trailing 8-3 and they came back. Now, could we see something like that happen in today's NHL? Maybe, but probably not as likely. And then the Avalanche overcame a 5-0 deficit against the Panthers in 1999. The Blues overcame a 5-0 deficit again in the third period against the Maple Leafs. In more recent years, and after that 04-05 lockout, you had the Rangers led by Jaromir Jagr overcoming a 5-0 deficit against the Canadiens. And then the next year, you had the Blackhawks overcoming a 5-0 deficit against the Calgary Flames. That was just after they had eliminated the Flames in the playoffs the previous postseason. As for the playoffs, there's only been one instance in which a team has overcome a deficit of at least 5 goals. A lot of you know about this. We've talked about this on the channel before. That is the Miracle on Manchester of 1982. The Edmonton Oilers, led by Wayne Gretzky, were leading the Kings 5-0 heading into the third period. And then LA storms back for 5 unanswered, including the tying goal with 5 seconds left, and then Darrell Evans wins it in overtime. And from what I was able to gather here, there are 3 other instances in which a team has battled back from a 4-goal deficit in a playoff game. So 1971, the Canadiens trailed 5-1 against the Boston Bruins in Game 2, and they would win that game, I believe, in overtime. 1985, the North Stars trailed the Blackhawks 4-0 in Game 5, and they stormed back to win. Again, I think in overtime. By the way, that series was so back and forth. Those were amazing games. Probably one of the better series that we don't talk about as often. And then 2011, my San Jose Sharks trailed 4-0 against the Los Angeles Kings in Game 3 of the first round. And then the Sharks win in overtime, a goal from Devin Setoguchi. And then lastly, the Canucks and Wild game had 17 goals, right? We saw that last year between the Kings and the Kraken. That ended in overtime on a goal from Andrei Burakovsky. That was a bonkers game. But even so, that was a little bit shy of what we saw in the 1980s. There were 3 instances in which we had a game of at least 20 goals. So they all came in 1984, 85, and 86. So in 84, the Oilers beat the North Stars 12-8 on January 4th. And in that game, Wayne Gretzky had 4 goals and 4 assists. Then 2 years later, on January 8th, 1986, the Maple Leafs beat the Oilers 11-9. Gretzky and Jari Kurri each had 6 points. But then the record for the most goals in the modern era in a single game is 21, when the Oilers won 12-9 against the Chicago Blackhawks on December 11th, 1985. So just a few weeks before the game we just talked about. These teams actually played each other just 3 days before that, with the Oilers winning 4-3. And in this game, Jari Kurri and Glenn Anderson each had a hat trick, and Wayne Gretzky, even though he didn't get a goal, well, he assisted on just about all of those, had 7 apples in that game. So anyway, Twisters, what are your thoughts with this? Is there too much scoring in today's NHL? What kind of hockey excites you the most? Is this the best era of hockey that you've seen so far? Let me know in the comments, and stick around for more coverage like this in between our other lengthier, more in-depth historical features. And in the meantime, you can also keep up with me on social media and join our Discord community so you can chat with other like-minded Twisters out there. We want to have all the fans from all around the world. It'd be great to see you on there. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining us for this video. I'm Nick. I hope you had a good time here, and I'll see you around for the next one. Ciao.